The sun hung low over the sprawling estate, as the sound of gravel crunching under tires echoed through the quiet farm. On the front porch of the grand farmhouse stood Richard Blackwell, the billionaire businessman, hands tucked into his tailored suit pockets. His piercing blue eyes scanned the horizon as his mind raced with the busy thoughts of a man who had spent a lifetime building empires. He had everything a man could want: wealth, power, respect, but there was something missing. The house, the land, the workers, everything felt like it lacked the final piece, the family he had lost so long ago. As the sun dipped lower, the low rumble of an approaching car broke his thoughts. He turned just in time to see an unfamiliar black sedan pull up to the front gate. The car rolled to a stop and, as the dust settled, the door opened. Out stepped a woman he had not seen in years, a woman he thought he had completely erased from his life. Sarah, his ex-wife, his former love. She stood there in the warm light of the setting sun, her figure a stark contrast against the opulence of the estate behind her. But it wasn't just Sarah who stood there. Behind her, 3 children stepped out of the car, each of them no older than 10 years old. As they moved closer, Richard's breath caught in his throat. They looked like him. Their eyes bright blue, their features sharp, strong, and unmistakably his. But that couldn't be. They couldn't be. Richard blinked, his mind struggling to process what was happening. How could they possibly be his children? Sarah had always told him she couldn't have children after their divorce. Yet, here they were. His heart pounded in his chest as Sarah walked toward him, her face betraying no emotion, as calm as if this moment was the most natural thing in the world. "Richard," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "Meet your children." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Richard's eyes darted to the children once more. His mind raced through 1,000 questions, each one more impossible than the last. These children, his children, were standing in front of him, and yet, all he had to show for the years they had been apart were these 3 children, looking at him with innocent eyes. He glanced at Sarah, his mind still grasping for an explanation, but she said nothing more. Instead, she simply stepped aside, allowing him to take in the reality of the situation. As the silence stretched on, Richard felt a growing sense of dread wash over him. What had happened in all those years? What had Sarah kept from him? He had lived his life, consumed by his empire, blind to the small, quiet moments that were happening just outside his world. And now, standing in front of him, were the results of all his mistakes: children who looked like him, children who were a part of him, children he never knew existed. His thoughts shattered, a deep ache taking root in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. All he could do was stand there, frozen, as the weight of the truth settled in, the truth that would change everything. Richard stood frozen, his mind racing as his eyes swept over the children before him. They looked so much like him: his nose, his jaw, the shape of their eyes, everything about them screamed that they were his. And yet, the idea that they could be his children, children he had never known existed, seemed impossible. He glanced at Sarah, his ex-wife, who stood silently beside the children, her expression unreadable. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, and Richard could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. There were too many questions, too much confusion, too much disbelief. Sarah, sensing his hesitation, spoke first. "I told you, Richard," she said quietly, her voice steady but with a hint of something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "You have 3 children. These are your triplets." The words struck him like a lightning bolt. Triplets. He had triplets. It was almost too much to process. How had this happened? How had she kept this from him all these years? The last time they had spoken, they had both moved on with their lives, and yet now here they were, standing in front of him. "How could you not tell me?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice thick with emotion. "How could you hide this from me for so long?" Sarah sighed, her eyes never leaving his. "It wasn't something I could just tell you over the phone or in a letter, Richard. You were too busy with your world, your empire. You never even asked about me or about us." Richard felt the sting of her words. It was true. He had buried himself in his work, in his businesses, in his endless pursuit of wealth and power. He had thought he was leaving the past behind, but the past had come rushing back with a force he couldn't escape. His mind flashed to the years he had spent focused on expanding his companies, hosting lavish parties, and making deals with people who only cared about his money. He had been a man consumed by ambition, leaving little room for anything else. But now, standing before him, were 3 children who were his flesh and blood, children he had never been a part of, children he had never known. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "They deserve to know their father," she said softly, "and I know you're not the same man you were back then. I know you can change." For them, Richard turned to look at the children again. They were quiet, standing there with wide eyes, as if they were unsure of what to make of the situation. They had every right to be confused, to be uncertain. He had been a ghost in their lives, a figure who had never been there for them. How could he fix that? How could he make up for all the lost years, the years they had spent growing up without a father? One of the triplets, a little girl with dark curly hair and bright blue eyes, took a step forward. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she should speak. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Are you really our dad?" The words hit Richard like a wave crashing on the shore. He looked at her, her innocent face full of hope and uncertainty, and he felt something inside of him shift. He had always prided himself on being a man of power, a man who controlled everything around him. But here, in this moment, he was powerless. He had no control over this situation, no way to change the past. All he could do now was stand there, in front of these children, and try to make things right. He knelt down to their level, looking into their eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have been there for you. I wasn't, but I'm here now, and I want to be a part of your lives. I want to get to know you." The little girl blinked, as if processing his words, before she reached out and placed her hand in his. Richard felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of guilt, regret, and something else, hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he might be able to do something right, something that mattered. Sarah watched the exchange quietly, her expression softening. "It's a start," she said quietly, almost to herself. But Richard wasn't thinking about the future just yet. He was still reeling from the shock of this moment. He had 3 children he had never known, and in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to be the father they deserved. Richard sat there, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. The air around him felt thick, almost suffocating. His thoughts were scattered, unable to focus on anything but the children standing before him, his children. They were so much like him, it was impossible to ignore. His heart clenched as he realized the magnitude of what he had just learned. He had missed out on so much, and now he was left with the aftermath of his own neglect. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching him closely, waiting for him to respond. But what could he say? How could he explain all the years that had passed? All the years he had spent building his empire, while his family had quietly faded into the background of his mind. He had been too caught up in his own world to see the one that was right in front of him. "I never knew," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know any of this." Sarah's expression softened, but there was no anger in her eyes, only sadness. "You were too busy, Richard. Too busy for me, too busy for them. You chose your empire over us. You never even asked how we were doing." Her words stung, sharper than he had expected. He had always known that his choices had consequences, but he had never fully understood just how much they had affected the people closest to him. The guilt gnawed at him now, and he couldn't escape it. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at the children again. "I should have been there. I should have been a part of their lives." The little girl, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward again. She looked at him with those wide, innocent eyes, full of hope and curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice small, almost hesitant. Richard blinked, taken aback by the question. "My name is Richard," he said softly, "but you can call me Dad, if you'd like." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. He had never imagined a moment like this, standing here, facing children who had no idea who he was, trying to earn their trust, trying to make up for years of absence. The girl hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Okay," she said, the smallest smile tugging at her lips. Richard's heart swelled with emotion. He had been given a chance to be the father he had never been, and while it was going to take time, and a lot of work. He was determined to make things right. He reached out to her, and she took his hand. For a moment, they stood there, the silence between them no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to him. Sarah watched the exchange quietly, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're going to have to earn their trust," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Richard nodded. He knew she was right. He had a long way to go before he could make up for the years he had lost, but he was willing to try. "I will," he said firmly. "I promise." The other two children, a boy and another girl, had been standing silently, watching their sister and Richard. They hadn't said much, but their eyes were fixed on him, studying him, as if waiting for some sign that he was really there to stay. Richard turned to them, kneeling down to their level. "I know I haven't been here for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I want to be. I want to be a part of your lives. I want to know who you are, what you love, what makes you happy. I want to be the father you deserve." The boy, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. He was older than his sister, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and his eyes were full of suspicion. "How do we know you mean it?" he asked, his voice sharp. Richard swallowed hard. It was a fair question. He had a lot to prove, and he knew it. "I can't expect you to believe me right away," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to show you, I'll show all of you, that I'm here to stay." The girl, who had been quiet, looked at him with a mixture of hope and doubt. "Will you stay for us?" she asked softly. Richard nodded. "I will, I promise." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of everything unsaid, of all the years Richard had missed, and all the years he still had to make up for. But for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he had a purpose. He had a chance to be more than just a businessman. He had a chance to be a father, and he wasn't going to waste it. Richard sat there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of his children on him, each gaze filled with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and hope. They were waiting for something, but what could he offer them? How could he possibly begin to make up for all the time he had lost, all the things he should have been there for, but never was? Sarah stood quietly in the background, her arms crossed, watching the exchange between them. Richard's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan, trying to figure out where to start. He had always been a man of action, used to commanding his businesses with a firm hand, but this was different. This was not a boardroom, and these were not deals to be made. These were his children, and they had every right to be uncertain, to be angry, to question him. He knew he couldn't expect instant forgiveness, but he needed to show them that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. He took a deep breath and looked at the children again, who were now standing a little closer to him. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. "I know I've missed a lot," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But I'm here now, and I want to make up for that. I want to be a father to you. I want to be part of your lives. I want to be someone you can trust." The little girl, the one who had reached out to him earlier, looked at him with wide, cautious eyes. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice small but piercing. Richard's heart sank. It was a question he had been dreading, but one he knew he had to answer. He looked at her, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "I made a lot of mistakes," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I focused too much on my work, on building my empire, and I lost sight of the people who mattered most, my family." There was a long pause. The boy, the one who had been quiet and distant, spoke up. "So, what? You just want to show up now and pretend like everything's okay?" His voice was sharp, full of distrust. Richard's stomach tightened. "No," he said firmly. "I don't expect everything to be okay overnight. I know I have to earn your trust. I know I've done things that can't be undone. But I'm here now, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The boy crossed his arms, his expression still one of defiance. "How do we know you mean it?" he asked. "How do we know you're not just saying what we want to hear?" Richard swallowed hard. It was a fair question. He had a lot to prove, and he knew it. "You don't have to believe me right away," he said. But I'm not going anywhere. I want to be a part of your lives, and I'm going to show you that I'm here for the long haul." The girl with the curly hair and bright blue eyes, the one who had been the most hesitant, stepped forward. "Will you be there for us when we need you?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was a quiet strength in it. Richard nodded, his throat tight. "Yes," he said. "I promise, I will be here for you, no matter what." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Richard wasn't sure how they would respond. But then, slowly, the boy uncrossed his arms, his gaze softening just a little. The girl with the curly hair smiled faintly, a small glimmer of trust in her eyes. And the youngest, the little girl who had asked if he was really their dad, looked at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll give you a chance." Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew it was just the beginning. This was only the first step, and there was so much more to do. He had to prove himself, not just with words, but with actions. He had to be there for them, every day, showing them that he was truly committed. Sarah watched the interaction quietly, her face softening just a little. She had seen the man he had been selfish, consumed by ambition, but now, standing before him, were the results of his choices, his children. And in this moment, Richard had made the first step toward changing not just his own life, but theirs as well. The silence in the room was no longer filled with tension. Instead, it was filled with the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, things could start to change. Richard stood up slowly and turned to Sarah. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, "for giving me this chance." Sarah nodded, her expression still neutral. "Don't waste it," she said quietly. Richard nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. This was his chance to make up for everything he had missed. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The next morning, Richard awoke with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The soft light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. He looked over at the empty space beside him, a reminder of how far he had come from the man he used to be. The quiet of the house was unsettling, but in a way, it felt right. For the first time, it wasn't just the sound of his work or the ticking of the clock that filled the silence, it was the potential of a new beginning. Richard stood up and walked over to the window, his gaze drifting across the expansive grounds of his estate. It was easy to get lost in the grandiosity of the place, to feel like it was all he needed. But as he looked out at the horizon, he realized that no amount of wealth could fill the void of a life lived without connection, without love, without the family that he had so carelessly neglected. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration welling up inside him. He had been given a chance, a rare chance, to fix things. But how could he make up for the years he had missed? How could he possibly undo the damage he had done? His mind drifted back to the moment the night before, when his children had finally accepted him, at least for the moment. The little girl had been the first to reach out, her small hand resting in his. That small act had felt like a spark of hope, a reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't too far gone to make a difference. But then the boy, with his guarded eyes, had challenged him. "How do we know you mean it?" he had asked, and the question had stuck with Richard. He couldn't just show up and expect everything to fall into place. He couldn't expect them to simply accept him after all the years he had spent in the shadows. They had every right to be cautious, to be skeptical. And Richard knew that gaining their trust would take time, but it had to start somewhere. It had to start today. He couldn't afford to waste another moment. Richard dressed quickly, his mind already focused on what he needed to do. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father, and that meant showing up, day after day, proving to his children that he could be the father they deserved. When he arrived downstairs, Sarah was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time, there was a softness in her gaze. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to show him that perhaps, just perhaps, things could change. "They're in the backyard," she said, breaking the silence. "The kids wanted to explore the property. Thought you might want to join them." Richard nodded, a sense of determination settling in his chest. "I will." As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit him, the scent of fresh grass and earth filling his lungs. He walked toward the backyard, where his children were playing near the edge of the garden. The boy was kicking a soccer ball with surprising skill, while the little girl and the other child, his son, were exploring the trees, their laughter ringing through the air. Richard watched them for a moment, hesitant. They hadn't fully accepted him yet. But this was his opportunity to prove himself. He walked over to them, and the boy stopped playing, turning his gaze toward Richard. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone still skeptical. Richard took a deep breath and knelt down to the boy's level, meeting his eyes. "I want to spend time with you," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I want to get to know you, all of you. I know I can't make up for the years I've lost, but I want to be here now." The boy stared at him for a long moment, and Richard held his gaze, waiting. Finally, the boy dropped his eyes to the ground, a subtle sign of acceptance. The girl, the one with the curly hair, ran up to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Can we show you the secret spot we found?" she asked eagerly. Richard smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. "I'd love that," he said, and with that, the three children led him to a small grove of trees, hidden away behind the house. As they walked, Richard couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, a chapter where he could finally make things right. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many more challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he was on the right path. As they reached the grove, the children showed him their favorite spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Richard looked around, taking in the peaceful scene. "This is beautiful," he said softly. "It's our special place," the girl replied, smiling. Richard looked at her, his heart full. He was learning what it meant to be there, to truly be present in their lives. "I'm glad you have a place like this," he said. "I'm going to make sure I'm here for you, always." The boy nodded, still quiet, but his expression was softer now, less guarded. It was a small step, but it was progress. As they spent the morning together, Richard realized that these moments, the simple ones, the ones spent with his children, were the ones that truly mattered. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, none of it mattered if he didn't have the people who mattered most. And now, as he stood in the grove, surrounded by his children, he knew he had a chance to build something more important than any business deal or financial success. He had a chance to build a family. The days that followed were not easy, but Richard was committed. Every morning, he woke up with one goal in mind: to prove to his children that he was here to stay. He had taken the first step, but he knew this journey would take time. Trust had to be earned. He had spent so many years focused solely on his empire, believing that success in business would fulfill him. But now, standing in front of his children, he realized how wrong he had been. He had missed their lives, missed their smiles, their laughter, their growth, and it was up to him to make up for it. One evening, after a quiet dinner at the family table, the little girl, the one who had first offered him her hand, approached him. She was holding something in her small hands, her expression serious. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I drew something for you." Richard looked up from his plate, surprised. "For me?" he asked, his heart swelling. She nodded and placed the drawing in front of him. It was a picture of their family, drawn with crayon, a simple sketch, but full of heart. There were three little figures, each with bright blue eyes and big smiles, standing together with their hands held. At the bottom, in big letters, were the words, "The best family ever." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the drawing and then back at the little girl, her eyes full of hope and innocence. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." The little girl smiled, her eyes lighting up. "I'm glad you like it," she said softly. Richard reached out and pulled her into a hug, the weight of the past few days settling in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he realized that, despite everything, there was still a chance for them to be a family again. Over the next few weeks, Richard worked hard to make up for the time he had lost. He spent hours with each of his children, getting to know them, listening to their stories, and sharing his own. He learned about their dreams, their fears, and their joys. They slowly began to open up to him, and though it was not always easy, He knew he was making progress. The boy, who had been the most distant, started to warm up. At first, he would barely acknowledge Richard's attempts to bond, but little by little, he began to talk to him about school, about his friends, about what he wanted to be when he grew up. One day, as they were walking through the gardens together, the boy looked up at him and said, "I don't know why you came back, but I think you're trying. I can see that." Richard's heart lifted. It was a small step, but it meant the world. "I am trying," Richard said quietly. "I'm trying because I want to be the father you deserve." The boy didn't say anything more, but for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only a flicker of something else, something that resembled hope. Richard didn't take it for granted. He knew that trust was fragile, and that it would take time to fully rebuild. But every moment with his children, every conversation, every shared laugh, brought them closer. As the days went on, Richard also noticed a change in Sarah. She wasn't as distant as before, and though she still maintained a cautious demeanor, there was something in her eyes, something that suggested she was beginning to see a different side of him. One afternoon, as they were having lunch together, she looked at him, her expression softening. "I can see you're really trying, Richard," she said. "I wasn't sure if you ever would, but now I believe you might actually be able to do this." Richard looked at her, his heart swelling. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'm not giving up. I want this. I want us to be a family." Sarah didn't respond right away, but the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was filled with understanding, with the possibility of something more. Richard's relationship with his children continued to grow. Every weekend, they went on outings, hiking, picnicking, visiting local museums, and slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. The more time they spent together, the more Richard realized just how much he had missed. One evening, as he was tucking the children into bed, the little girl looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to stay with us forever?" Richard paused, the question hitting him harder than he had expected. He smiled softly and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to stay with you forever." She smiled, her eyes shining with the innocence of a child who believed in the promise of a better future. As he walked out of their room that night, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Weeks passed, and the sense of progress Richard had felt at first began to settle into a new, quieter rhythm. He had been spending more and more time with his children, and every moment felt like another step in the journey he had started. It was still difficult. There were days when the shadows of the past would creep in, when the weight of everything he had missed seemed almost too much to bear. But there were also moments of connection, small victories that reminded him of why he was doing this. One afternoon, as Richard and the children sat in the living room, the boy, who had been the most skeptical of him, finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Richard looked up from the book he had been reading, nodding. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The boy hesitated for a moment, as though carefully considering his words. "Why did you come back? After all this time, why now?" Richard felt a lump form in his throat. It was the question that had been lingering in his mind for weeks. Why now? He had spent so many years focused on his career, building an empire, believing that wealth and success would bring him fulfillment. But none of that had mattered when he had looked at his children and realized they didn't know him. He hadn't been there when they needed him the most. "I came back because I realized something," Richard said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I realized that no matter how much money I made, no matter how many deals I closed, it wouldn't mean anything if I didn't have a family to share it with. You, all of you, you matter more than anything I've ever done. And I don't want to miss another moment with you." The boy didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, watching Richard with a mix of disbelief and something softer. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay," he said simply. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was progress. The boy was starting to understand. That was all Richard could ask for. Later that week, as the family sat around the dinner table, Sarah spoke up. "You've done well, Richard," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of something warmer in it than before. "You've been there for the kids. You've made an effort. I see it." Richard looked at her, surprised. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Sarah's expression softened, and she gave a small, knowing smile. "You still have a long way to go, but I can see the change, and so can they." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was a reminder that he couldn't stop now. He had a lifetime of catching up to do, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. "I'll keep trying," he promised. The days that followed brought more moments of connection. They went on family outings, trips to the park, visits to the zoo, and with each passing day, Richard felt more and more like he was part of their world. But it wasn't just the children who were changing. He was changing too. The man who had once been driven only by ambition was beginning to understand what it meant to be truly present. One evening, after a long day spent playing catch in the backyard, Richard sat on the porch with the children as the sun set behind the trees. The boy sat beside him, still quiet but more at ease than he had been in the past. After a moment of silence, the boy spoke again. "You know, I think you're actually trying to be a good dad," he said, his voice almost shy. Richard smiled, a warm feeling spreading through him. "I am," he said softly. "I really am." The boy nodded, as if the words had settled into place. I think you're getting there." The words hit Richard like a wave. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step. It was a sign that his efforts were starting to pay off, that he was no longer just a stranger in their lives, but a father trying to make things right. The little girl, who had been running around with her siblings, stopped and looked at Richard. "Daddy," she said, her voice full of innocence and trust. "Will you always be here now?" Richard's heart ached at the question, and he smiled at her, his eyes softening. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She beamed, and for the first time in his life, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. He had a family, he had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Later that night, as Richard lay in bed, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. He had come a long way from the man who had once been so consumed by his career that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Now, he had the chance to build something real, a family, a future, and a bond that would last a lifetime. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. He was ready to be the father his children deserved, and as he drifted off to sleep that night, for the first time in years, Richard felt hopeful about the future. It had been several months since Richard had made the commitment to be a part of his children's lives, and while progress had been slow, it was undeniable. The bond between them was growing stronger each day. They still had a long way to go, but every small moment, every step forward, reinforced that this was not just a passing effort. Richard was here for the long haul, and he was determined to prove it. One evening, as Richard was returning home after a long day at the office, he was surprised to find Sarah waiting for him in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, looking at him with an expression that he couldn't quite read. "Richard," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made him pause. He set down his briefcase and walked over to her, sensing something important was coming. "What's wrong?" he asked, his heart already starting to race. Sarah looked at him with a mix of emotions. She wasn't angry, but there was a clear sadness in her eyes. "The kids," she said quietly. "They're starting to get attached to you. They're starting to trust you." Richard nodded, trying to gauge where this was going. "That's a good thing, right?" he asked cautiously. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking again. "It is. But they're also scared." Richard furrowed his brow. "Scared of what?" "Scared that you'll leave again," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They've been through a lot already, Richard, and they're not sure if they can handle being let down again." Richard felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had known this day might come, the day when his children would start to feel vulnerable, when they would begin to realize that trusting him meant risking getting hurt. But hearing Sarah say it out loud made it all too real. "I understand," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "But I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I promise you, I'm here for them, for all of you." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "I hope you mean that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because they've been through so much already. I just don't want them to get hurt again." Richard reached out and took her hand, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I won't hurt them," he said firmly. "I'll never hurt them again. I know I've messed up in the past, but I won't make that mistake anymore." Sarah squeezed his hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I need to believe you, Richard. I really do." "You will," Richard said, his voice unwavering. "I'll show you. I'll show all of you. I'm not leaving. I'm staying." The silence between them was thick, but for the first time in months, it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something solid in the air, a quiet understanding that things were changing, that the family they were becoming was something worth fighting for. The next day, Richard woke up early, determined to take the next step. He knew the kids were scared, and while he couldn't completely erase their fears, he could show them through his actions that he was here to stay. He decided to do something special. After breakfast, he told them that he had a surprise for them, something he had been planning for a while. The children's eyes lit up with excitement, their previous apprehension momentarily forgotten. They followed him outside, where he had set up a picnic in the backyard. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple blanket on the grass, with sandwiches, fruit, and drinks, but it was a gesture. It was a promise. "I wanted to do something different today," Richard said, looking at each of them. "Something to show you that I'm here, and I want to be part of your lives, every single day." The children gathered around the blanket, their smiles wide as they sat down to enjoy the meal together. The little girl, the one who had first offered him her drawing, turned to him and asked, "Are we going to do this every week?" Richard smiled, his heart swelling. "If that's okay with you," he said, "we can have picnics every week, or do whatever you want. I'm here for you." The boy, who had been quiet but receptive, glanced at him before speaking. I think it'd be nice," he said, his voice soft, but there was no mistaking the sincerity behind his words. Richard felt a flood of relief wash over him. It was a small moment, but it was a big one. It was a sign that, despite the fear, despite the hurt they had all carried for so long, they were starting to trust him. They were starting to believe in him again. As the afternoon wore on, they played games, told stories, and laughed together. Richard felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't known in years. It was the kind of warmth that came from real connection, from building something meaningful. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Richard sat back on the blanket, watching his children. They were laughing, carefree, and for the first time, he realized how much he had missed. He had spent so many years chasing success, but this, the joy, the love, the bond was what truly mattered. This was the life he wanted. This was the family he had been given a second chance to build. As the day came to an end, and the children began to head inside, Richard stayed behind for a moment, looking up at the sky. It was as though the weight of everything that had come before was starting to lift, replaced by a quiet hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. Richard stood at the window, looking out over the vast expanse of his property. The estate he had once seen as the culmination of all his dreams, the embodiment of success, now felt empty. His mind wandered back to the day he first saw his children, those three faces staring back at him, full of hope and uncertainty. It had been a jarring, painful realization that he had missed so much, that in his relentless pursuit of wealth and power, he had forgotten what truly mattered. But here he was now, trying to rebuild, trying to undo years of neglect. He had come so far, yet there were still moments when doubt crept in. Could he really make up for everything he had missed? Could he be the father they deserved? As the days passed, Richard grew more and more committed to his role as a father. He spent every free moment with his children, learning about their likes, their dislikes, their fears, and their dreams. It wasn't easy. There were times when they would pull back, when the walls would go up again, but each time they did, Richard found the strength to push through. He couldn't afford to give up, not when they were finally beginning to trust him. One evening, after a long day of working at his office, Richard returned home to find the house unusually quiet. As he walked into the living room, he was surprised to see his children sitting together on the couch, looking at him expectantly. "Dad," the boy said, his voice hesitant. Richard sat down beside them, his heart skipping a beat. He could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet tension in the air. "What's going on?" he asked gently. The little girl, the one who had always been the first to approach him, spoke up. "We've been talking," she said, her voice quiet but serious. "And we want to ask you something." Richard's heart raced. He hadn't been expecting this, but he knew it was important. "What do you want to ask?" The boy looked at him, his eyes serious. "You say you're going to stay, but how do we know you won't just leave again?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, Richard was silent. He had known this moment would come, the moment when his children would question his commitment. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going anywhere. "I can't change the past," Richard said softly, his voice steady. "I can't go back and undo the mistakes I've made. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving, I promise you." There was a long pause as the children sat there, processing his words. Richard could see the doubt in their eyes. But there was something else there too, something that resembled hope. "I know I've let you down," Richard continued, "but I want to make things right. I want to be a part of your lives. I'm not going anywhere." The boy still didn't say anything, but the little girl looked at him with wide eyes, as if searching for the truth in his words. After a long silence, the boy spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I want to believe you," he said quietly. Richard smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. It was a start. "I'm going to show you," Richard said, his voice firm. "Every day, I'm going to show you that I'm here for you. I'm going to be the father you deserve." As the evening wore on, Richard felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that it would take time for his children to fully trust him again. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to give up. He had been given a second chance, and he was going to make the most of it. The next morning, Richard woke up early, his mind already focused on the day ahead. He had promised his children that he was going to stay, and today he was going to prove it. He planned a special outing for them, a trip to the beach. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple day by the water, but it was a gesture. It was his way of showing them that he was committed to being there for them. When the children found out about the trip, their faces lit up with excitement. The boy, who had been the most hesitant, was the first to grab his shoes and run toward the door. The little girl followed, laughing as she skipped along behind him. For the first time, Richard felt like a father, truly present in their lives. The day at the beach was everything Richard had hoped for and more. They spent the day playing in the sand, building castles, and splashing in the waves. Richard watched his children as they laughed and played, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the children sat on the beach, watching the waves roll in. The boy, who had been quiet for most of the day, turned to Richard and said, "This was fun. I'm glad you're here." Richard's heart swelled. It was a simple statement, but it meant everything. "I'm glad I'm here too," he said, his voice full of emotion, "and I'm not going anywhere." As they packed up to head home, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a significant step forward. He had proven to his children that he was here for them, and he wasn't going to leave. It was a promise he intended to keep. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges, but Richard knew that as long as he kept showing up, kept proving his commitment, they could build something strong, something lasting. He was no longer just a father in name. He was their father, and he was going to stay. He wasn't going anywhere. Richard had been feeling the weight of his past mistakes for months, but each day, his children were proving to him that he could make things right. They were starting to trust him, to believe in him again, and each new moment felt like a small victory. But deep down, Richard knew that the real test had yet to come. His children had begun to open up to him, but the journey toward full trust was far from over. He had no illusions about that. He had to prove his commitment, day by day. He couldn't just promise to stay, he had to show them that he meant it. It was late one afternoon when the moment came. Richard had been away for a few days for work, and when he returned home, he found his children acting a little differently. They were quieter, more reserved, as if waiting for something, unsure of what to expect. Richard's heart sank as he saw the change in their demeanor. He knew they were still unsure, still holding back just a little. That night, after dinner, Richard gathered the children in the living room. They sat around him, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. "What's going on?" he asked gently, sensing the unease in the room. The boy, who had always been the most guarded, looked up at him. "We heard some stuff," he said, his voice low. "Some people were talking. They said you might leave again." Richard's heart tightened at the words. He knew the rumors, the doubts. They were inevitable. He had been absent for so long, and now, even though he was trying, the fear of abandonment still lingered in his children's hearts. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I know you're scared," he began softly, "and I can't change the past. I know I've hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know something. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for good, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." The little girl, who had always been the most trusting, looked at him with wide eyes. "But how do we know you won't leave again?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Richard swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. He knew the fear in her voice. He knew that, deep down, she was afraid of losing him. "Because this time, I'm not just promising to be here," he said, his voice steady. "This time, I'm showing you. Every day, I'm going to be here, no matter what. I won't let you down again." The room was silent for a moment. The children looked at him, processing his words, as if trying to decide if they could trust him. Richard felt the weight of their gazes, the gravity of the promise he was making. And then, slowly, the boy spoke up. "I want to believe you," he said quietly. "I really do." Richard nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I know it's hard," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm going to keep showing you that I mean it." The little girl, after a long pause, reached out and took his hand. "Okay," she said softly. Richard smiled, his heart swelling. It wasn't the end of their journey, not by a long shot, but it was a step forward. It was a sign that, despite everything, they were beginning to trust him again. That night, as Richard tucked the children into bed, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The fears were still there, the doubts lingering in the background, but the promise he had made was real. He had shown them that he was here, that he wasn't leaving. And in that moment, he knew that he had taken the first real step toward healing the wounds of the past. The next morning, as they gathered for breakfast, Sarah looked at him with a knowing glance. There was something softer in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "I see it, Richard," she said, her voice quiet. "You're really trying, and they see it too." Richard nodded, his heart full. "I'm not giving up," he said simply. "I'm here for them, for all of you." Sarah didn't say anything more, but Richard could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a small shift, but it was significant. It meant that they were all moving forward, together. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be moments of doubt. But for the first time, Richard felt confident that they could build something real, something lasting. He wasn't just the man who had made mistakes. He was their father, and he was here to stay. Richard woke up earlier than usual the next morning, the soft light of dawn creeping through the curtains. He lay there for a moment, his eyes closed, just listening to the quiet. It was a rare moment of stillness, a moment of peace before the day began. He had come a long way from the man he had once been. The man who had been so consumed by work that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had made so many mistakes, but now he had a second chance. He wasn't going to waste it. He had promised his children that he would stay, that he would be there for them, and he intended to keep that promise. The past few weeks had been challenging, but each day had brought a new opportunity to prove himself, not just with words but with actions. His children were starting to trust him again, little by little, and that meant everything to him. Today, Richard had something planned. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple gesture, but it was important. He wanted to do something that would show his children that he was there for them in a way that they could truly understand. He had arranged for a surprise outing, something special for just the four of them. It was a small step, but it was part of his larger plan to rebuild their relationship. As the kids woke up and made their way downstairs, they saw him waiting with a smile on his face. "We're going on a little adventure today," he said, his voice light and cheerful. "I've got a surprise for you." The children exchanged curious looks, their excitement palpable. The boy, who had been the most reserved, raised an eyebrow. "What's the surprise?" he asked, clearly intrigued. Richard grinned. You'll see soon enough." After breakfast, they piled into the car and headed out to a local nature reserve, a place Richard knew would be perfect for them to spend the day together. It was a quiet, serene spot, far from the busy world he had built for himself. Here, in the middle of nature, he could truly connect with his children, away from distractions, away from the weight of his past mistakes. As they arrived and stepped out of the car, the children's faces lit up with excitement. They ran toward the trails, eager to explore, and Richard followed, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. They hiked together, stopping occasionally to look at wildlife or take in the beautiful scenery. Richard watched his children, their faces full of wonder, and realized just how much he had missed. This was what mattered. This was what he had been missing. The boy, who had remained cautious at first, was now smiling and laughing, talking to Richard about everything from school to his favorite hobbies. The little girl, who had always been the most open, kept showing him all the things she found along the trail: bright flowers, rocks with strange patterns, even a small bird's nest. The time spent together felt natural, comfortable, and for the first time in a long while, Richard realized that he wasn't just their father in name. He was truly a part of their lives, and they were beginning to see him that way too. After a long day of exploring, they sat down by a quiet pond, the sun beginning to set in the distance. Richard looked at his children, their faces glowing in the soft light. It was a moment of calm, of contentment, something he had never really experienced before. The boy, who had been so distant at first, leaned over to him. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "This was really fun." Richard smiled, his heart swelling. "I'm glad you had fun," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'm glad we're doing this together." The little girl jumped up, twirling around in the grass. "Can we come back here again?" she asked, her eyes full of excitement. Richard laughed. "Of course. We can come back as many times as you want." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. There would be difficult days ahead, times when they would all struggle, but they were moving forward. He was earning their trust, proving that he wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly hopeful. The next morning, Richard sat in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, when Sarah walked in. She looked at him, her expression a little softer than it had been in the past. "How did they do?" she asked, her voice warm. Richard smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lifting. "They had a great time," he said. "We're making progress, Sarah. We really are." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "I can see that," she said quietly. "I know it's been hard, but I think you're really here this time." Richard met her gaze, feeling a sense of relief. "I am," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were filled with more small moments, more time spent with his children, more proof that he was here, that he was committed. Richard knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready for it. He had made mistakes, but he was determined to fix them, to be the father his children deserved. And with each passing day, that promise was becoming more and more real. The days had been getting easier for Richard, but he knew that he had only just begun to rebuild the trust that had been broken. His children were starting to trust him again, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Every smile, every moment of laughter, was a step in the right direction, but Richard couldn't help but feel the weight of the promise he had made. He had been given a second chance, but that didn't mean he could take it for granted. He had to keep showing up, day after day, proving that he was truly committed to being the father his children deserved. One evening, after dinner, Richard sat down with his kids. The living room was filled with the warmth of their laughter and the soft hum of conversation. The boy, who had once been the most reserved, had started to open up more, his guard slowly coming down. "Dad," he said, his voice a little hesitant, "there's something I've been thinking about." Richard looked up, meeting his son's gaze. "What's on your mind?" "Well," the boy paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about the past, and how things were before. I used to be so mad at you for leaving, for not being around, and I still get mad sometimes. But I can see you're really trying now." Richard's heart swelled at his son's words. "I know I've let you down," he said quietly. "And I'll never be able to undo the mistakes I made. But I promise you, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. The boy didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened. Richard could see the conflict in his son's face. It was clear that trust wasn't something that could be repaired overnight, but this was progress. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. The little girl, who had been sitting on the floor, suddenly jumped up and ran over to Richard, throwing her arms around him. "I'm glad you're here, Daddy," she said, her voice full of emotion. Richard wrapped his arms around her, his heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad I'm here too, sweetheart," he whispered, holding her close. "I'll always be here." The warmth in the room, the closeness, felt real. For the first time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But just as the moment seemed to settle into something peaceful, there was a knock on the door. Richard's heart skipped a beat. It was unexpected, and the last thing he wanted was something to disrupt this fragile moment. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find Sarah standing there, holding an envelope in her hand. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "Is everything okay?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said simply, handing him the envelope. Richard took the envelope, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "What's this?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Just open it," Sarah said, her tone quiet. Richard ripped open the envelope and pulled out a letter. As he read the words, his stomach dropped. The letter was from his lawyer, detailing the next steps in the divorce proceedings, setting a court date. The shock hit him like a ton of bricks. He had thought, maybe naively, that the worst was behind him, that he was finally on the path to rebuilding everything he had lost. But this letter, this unexpected development, was a reminder that the past was never truly gone. "Sarah, Richard started, but Sarah held up her hand, cutting him off. "This is just a formality," she said, her voice steady but distant. "But I needed you to know. It's happening. I don't know how you're going to handle this, but you need to be ready." Richard stood there for a moment, the weight of the letter in his hands, the room suddenly feeling colder. His mind raced, but no words came. He had thought that by showing up, by proving his commitment to his children, he could somehow fix everything. But now, in this moment, it felt like the world was slipping away from him once again. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she saw the struggle in his face. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Richard," she said quietly. "But we need closure. We need to move on, for the sake of the kids." Richard nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of her words. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just need some time to think." Sarah nodded, then turned and left, leaving Richard standing at the door with the letter in his hands. He stood there for a long time, staring at the words on the page. The reality of what was happening started to sink in. The life he had worked so hard to rebuild, the life with his children, was suddenly in danger of slipping through his fingers. Richard took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this tear everything apart again. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. He had to show his children that he was committed, that he was there for them no matter what. As the evening wore on, Richard sat in the living room with his kids, trying to push the weight of the situation to the back of his mind. He smiled, laughed, and did everything he could to make the evening feel normal. But deep down, he knew that things were changing. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: he couldn't lose his family again. Not now. Not after everything he had done to get them back. He wouldn't let it happen. He couldn't. The days that followed were some of the most challenging Richard had faced in his life. The letter from his lawyer had thrown him into a storm of uncertainty, and the reality of his situation had set in like a heavy weight. Divorce was inevitable. He had been given a second chance to be a father, but now the very foundation of the life he had been rebuilding was crumbling. He spent long hours thinking about the promise he had made to his children. He had told them he was here to stay, that he wasn't going anywhere. But with this divorce looming, Richard felt like a hypocrite. Could he really keep his word when the past had come rushing back? Could he truly fix everything? The next evening, after the kids were tucked in, Richard sat alone in the living room, the weight of the evening pressing on him. The house felt emptier now. It wasn't just the absence of Sarah. It was the realization that, despite his best efforts, His life still seemed to be falling apart. He had been given a chance to rebuild, to be the father his children deserved. But now, it seemed like he was losing everything once again. He knew he had to act. He couldn't sit back and let his family fall apart. He had worked so hard to build a relationship with his children, and he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. He couldn't let them think that he was just another person who abandoned them. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He would fight not just for the custody of his children, but for the chance to be a part of their lives in a way that was real, that was consistent. He wasn't just going to be the father who showed up when it was convenient or when things were easy. He was going to be there, through the hard times too. Richard called his lawyer and arranged a meeting. He needed to understand what his options were. But more than that, he needed to be prepared to fight for what he had been building. As he sat across from his lawyer later that week, he felt a sense of determination that had been missing for too long. "I need to fight for my children," Richard said, his voice steady. "I know the divorce is happening, but I won't let that tear us apart." The lawyer nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We can work on a plan, Richard," the lawyer said, "but you have to be prepared for a tough fight. If you want full custody, you'll need to prove to the court that you are a stable, reliable presence in their lives." Richard nodded. "I can do that," he said. "I will do whatever it takes." The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Richard felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was taking control of his future, and that meant everything. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings, legal battles, and a constant back and forth with Sarah. It wasn't easy, but Richard knew that he couldn't give up. As the days turned into weeks, he continued to spend every moment he could with his children, showing them that he was there for them, no matter what. They were hesitant at first, still unsure of what the future held, but little by little, they began to see that Richard wasn't going anywhere. They saw the effort he was putting in, the way he was showing up for them every day. One evening, after a particularly difficult court session, Richard sat on the porch with his children, the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The boy, who had grown more and more comfortable with him, turned to him and said, "Dad, I know things have been really hard, but I think you're going to make it." Richard looked at his son, the sincerity in his eyes taking him by surprise. "You really think so?" Richard asked, his voice full of emotion. The boy nodded. "Yeah, I know you're here for us. I know you're not going anywhere." Richard smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't easy, but this was proof that everything he had worked for wasn't in vain. The road ahead would still be tough, but he wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight for his children, for the family he was rebuilding. And he would keep his promise, no matter what. As the days passed and the legal proceedings moved forward, Richard continued to prove himself, not just through words, but through actions. He became more involved in his children's daily lives, helping with school projects, attending parent-teacher meetings, taking them to their extracurricular activities. Slowly, the children began to trust him more and more, and the fear of abandonment started to fade. It was in these moments, the small, everyday moments, that Richard found his true purpose. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to squander it. Then, one afternoon, as Richard was sitting with the kids in the living room, Sarah came in. She was carrying a small envelope, and for a moment, Richard's heart sank. He didn't know what to expect, but as she handed it to him, she smiled. "I think it's time," she said quietly. Richard opened the envelope, and his eyes widened as he saw the papers inside, papers that marked the finalization of their divorce, but more importantly, papers that granted him shared custody of the children. It wasn't full custody, but it was a start. It was a sign that his fight had paid off. He looked up at Sarah, who was watching him with a soft expression. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with something softer. "I know you're trying, Richard. And that's enough for now." Richard smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a huge step forward. He had fought for his family, and he was getting the chance to be there for them. As the evening drew to a close, Richard sat with his children, watching the sun dip below the horizon. They were no longer the strangers they had been when he first walked back into their lives. They were his family, and he was there to stay. The promise he had made was finally becoming a reality, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure: he would always be there for them. Discover the emotional journey in this powerful story of a father's redemption and his fight to rebuild the trust of his children in the face of past mistakes. Black stories explore themes of family, love, and second chances, and this heartwarming narrative delves deep into the complexities of reconciling with loved ones. As Richard navigates the struggles of rebuilding his relationship with his children, Black Stories shows the resilience needed to overcome both personal and familial challenges. Through love, determination, and unwavering commitment, this story reminds us that redemption is always possible, no matter how long the road may seem. If you've ever wondered how deep bonds can be restored, this Black story is sure to inspire. With every moment of growth and every step forward, Richard's journey proves that even in the face of adversity, the power of family and forgiveness can prevail.